Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Monday Morning Musing. Steve Crosby here, where we're talking about Reformation myths, lies, and half-truths that you've been told. And this one, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the backstory narratives that you've been told that don't hold water when examined historically. We're going to start with the 95 Theses. Now, I touched on this a little bit earlier in one of the other episodes. I want to revisit it again for a couple of reasons and integrate it with some other thought. All right, you've all seen the picture. Luther's challenging the Roman Church. He goes to the Wittenberg Church and he nails his theses to the church door. And, I've seen the paintings. You got people and just marveling. What a brave man he was to challenge the Pope. That's not what happened. In the last several episodes back, I pointed out that the church door was a community bulletin board. You posted everything there. It was public announcements. Secondly, and I mentioned this, it was an invitation to an academic university debate. Look, there were universities all over Germany, and they were all jockeying for preeminence and fame. And this would be no different than a professor putting out something to argue about in an academic setting. He wasn't targeting the Pope or Catholicism in a reformer's sort of way. Yes, he was acknowledging that there were problems and these problems needed to be addressed, and it was an invitation to an academic debate. But what happened is other people took the 95 Theses and, like little rats, ran down to Rome and said, look what this guy's saying, look what this guy's saying. And so it was second parties who shoved it in Leo's face and stirred the pot and got the debate going. Personally, where it got personal between Luther and Leo and where their egos kicked in. Now, Luther wasn't stupid. He knew what he was going to be sharing would be controversial. And he knew that it can't be found in the entire Christian tradition. What I'm about to say, in any of the church fathers, Luther's doctrine cannot be found. And Luther's doctrine is this: he was the first one to make justification and sanctification two separate events. For 1,500 years, that had never been taught before. Now, Luther was smart enough to know what he was doing, and he was going to make his case. But when Luther was confronted on his deviation from the tradition, that was the argument that the Catholic and the Pope used against him. That you are not holding to, you're not retaining the tradition. And Luther's premise was, that's because their tradition is wrong. So I'm here, now I'm talking about at the Diet at Worms and a little later on. But the rationale was, this is error that needs to be reformed. Well, when Luther got into it with the Anabaptists, when he got into dispute with the Anabaptists, guess what argument Luther used against the Anabaptists as he persecuted the Anabaptists? And this is a quote: "They do not abide in the traditions that we've received." He uses the same argument against the Anabaptists that was used against him by Rome. The same argument. You see, it's all about who is perceived as being deviant and who has power to declare deviancy and who doesn't. He used the same argument. And of course, he persecuted them and his followers. Another myth of the Reformation is that the church was in great darkness and had been for centuries. And we're actually going to devote an entire session to the myth of the Dark Ages. So I'm not going to go too deeply into that now because we're going to cover it later in a bit. But fundamental to the Protestant narrative that's necessary to make it work is that, the church was in this just tremendous period of darkness as Roman Catholicism got more apostate, and it's just the Dark Ages. And on the secular side, the Renaissance elevates humanity, and then on the theological side, the Reformation and us, we bring a light to humanity because it was just so dark. And supposedly Luther comes along, and there's this great revival, the oppressed masses of Europe who've been just longing and waiting to hear the word of God just come thronging to the church. Never happened. The churches were empty. And the people who did come were often drunk. They would sing dirty songs during the sermon. They'd bring their animals and pigs and everything else. How do we know? Because in good old German fashion, they were very thorough. And Luther actually sent out his delegates to his churches to see how they were doing. And you know what the most common... These reports exist. You can see them today. And you know what the pastors in those churches are saying? There's nobody here. We're preaching to empty buildings. And when people do come, they're drunk and they're coarse and they're bawdy and they don't pay attention. So this idea that the Reformation brought this tremendous, like the modern idea of great revival is simply absurd. Never happened. Another thing that folks need to understand is Luther and the various Protestant leaders that followed him aligned themselves with various princes and kings in the area. And ultimately, because that was wedded to money and power, it ultimately led to the 100 Years' War and soaking Europe in bloodshed, Catholic and Protestant hostilities. The Protestant narrative goes that these various princes, were just so moved by the brilliance of Luther's theology and were so concerned about piety and, Reformation doctrine that, bam, they jumped, some of them jumped on board the Lutheran ship and some didn't. And it was all about doctrine. It wasn't about doctrine at all. It was about money and power. The princes weren't stupid. They realized that if they went with Luther's side of things, they got to keep their money. They didn't have to send it to Rome anymore. The tithes and the offerings stayed in the hometown instead of getting shipped off to Rome, the 1/10 or whatever they were doing. If you're a politician, it doesn't take too much depth of thought to say, I'm going with this guy. That was a motive for some of the princes to hook their wagon. And then plus, the princes could seize church property that belonged to the Church of Rome. They just confiscated it. As a matter of fact, Henry VIII in England, like when he shut down the monasteries and he confiscated their property. Now, you need to grab this. He confiscated the equivalents in today's dollars of $113 billion worth, modern money, of assets he just swiped from the Church of Rome and put it into his own coffers. Now, my friends, how is that noble? How is that glorious? How is that God exalting? Well, God can use defective people. Okay. If you're going to go down that line, then you have to acknowledge that God can use a defective organization full of defective people, and there's no legitimacy for you as a Protestant. Because that means God could use a defective church. So these are some very concise and short versions of elements of some of the myths that you have been told. I'll see you the next time.